Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. This computer, all right. As I always say, I'm recording. How are you, Chris?
I'm good, thank you, Jeremy. You all right?
Very good. Any gaming? Or I know you did gaming. You went and did your Star Wars mini stuff. I saw pictures.
I
Of
did.
Cool.
I went to my first tournament for a year, and like my first proper tournament for 18 months, because I kind of stopped playing Marvel and haven't played anything like that. I briefly played this sort of samurai thing called Bushido, but I kind of I played it a bit, went to the tournament, played it, went, oh, this isn't for me, and haven't looked back at that. But yeah, I went to play the new Star Wars miniature game. So I had a whole day playing miniatures, which I haven't done in like a year, which is kind of crazy.
Very
so that
good.
was good. And then Friday night, yeah, the guys, we played a board game, and then we started thinking about what role playing we were going to play next. Yep.
So before I go off for vacation, though, we wanted to touch one of the third rails. I guess we wanted to get in trouble and
I do not want to get in trouble.
Okay, we're not going to get in trouble.
You might get in trouble because you want to be.
I'm not going to get in trouble at all. But we're going to talk about. Say it. Cue it up. Today
we're going to talk about religion. What? Religion in games.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to talk about religion in the real world.
Totally. We did an episode a while back about what the things we hate in combat in RPGs, and I think that for me at least, there's going to be an undertone of the frustrations and absurdity with religion in games, at least for me. I just wanted to preface this by saying that, and I used to say this, excuse me, when I taught world history ages ago, and obviously you have to park on the major world religions and others because that shapes in many cases how people perceive the world, how they perceive others, and then how they act based on those perceptions and beliefs. And so I always used to, I padded myself from controversy by saying, it doesn't matter what we all think about it. It matters what they thought about these things and how they acted accordingly. And so that view, I have that same view within games. Like if religion is something that someone believes, if a religion is, or a god they follow or whatever, the extent to which it shapes their perceptions and their beliefs and their values. And then there's also this question of to what extent does that belief shape their actions, what they will do, what they won't do, what they will stop from being done or try to, or ignore, or overlook, or whatever. How will this affect them? And my point of frustration, frankly, is where in the vast majority of cases, that is non-existent. And so that will be my underlying gripe, especially when we talk about fantasy games. But there's also layers of absurdity and silliness that are that you find in other games, in other genres, rather.
This is the thing that had popped into my head, and I was going to do a blog post or put it on the internet. And when I have a podcast, I can literally have a conversation with another human being that isn't going to just shout offensive stuff at me. I can have a conversation about it. Because it was just that thing that popped into my head, like, right, well, this is what religion is like in our world, and this is how people act.
Yeah.
But in a fantasy world, it should be different, but I don't perceive it to actually come across that way. And then another sense. So let's start with another. Let's go far ahead into the future. I said I wanted to mention Star Trek because it always crossed my mind that Star Trek's not that far in the future. It's 300 years ish in the future, depending on which kind of Star Trek you're looking at. And almost never do I see someone on the Enterprise or, insert other ship talking about religion. In this day and age, you will have people that will have, I was going to say prayer breaks. That's not the right thing, but if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And, people on a Sunday will go to church and other nights for other religions. So I don't ever remember seeing anyone. Is there a prayer room on the Enterprise? Because there should be. Because it's only 300 years. I refuse to believe that 300 years from now, just because they live in a sort of post-scarcity economy, that religion just suddenly goes out the window. Well, in fact, what we have is But in fact, religion, the places they find that do have religion, they almost make out to be like, not, whack jobs or something.
Well, this is fascinating because there's a bit of that, but there's also like you've got in Deep Space Nine, you've got the Bajorans, and so much of their culture and their
Yes.
society and their government is wrapped around their religion, which is wrapped up in the prophets, the wormhole aliens. So in a weird way, you've got the writers in the background implying like you're just worshiping space aliens who live in.
Well, that's what they were doing.
But well, so there's that. You've got the Klingons, and we have episodes where they go. I mean, Voyager, and I believe Deep Space Nine, and definitely what's it called? Next Generation. You have talk of Klingon religious matters and their afterlife, like the good and the bad, the Valhalla ish and the opposite. You've got what is it, Stovokor, and what's the other one, the bad one?
Yeah, I know what you mean. But yeah, they have a it is kind of so it is similar to the Norse stuff.
They have that. I don't know of any mention of Romulan religion. I don't remember. Nor Cardassians. I don't remember. Although the weird thing is, remember the Klingons said, we killed our gods. We had no need for them. Like Worf made some comment about that, but there's still this whole idea of an afterlife.
Yeah.
So that's a little, that's something
well,
they didn't.
The Vulcans have.
I don't know.
Because the Vulcans, you can see being like, they're, because the way they act is almost bordering on like spiritual. I guess the Vulcans actually are kind of quite a kind of Buddhist Zen type.
What it seems to me is that what Star Trek does with faith, religion, spirituality, and maybe those are, I actually see those as three different things. Maybe there's overlap between them, but what Star Trek does is they, aside from one moment that I know of in all of Star Trek, they avoid any real human religion.
Yeah.
But what they do is they explore the overall idea of religion in various sparing ways through other cultures, like alien cultures. So they don't touch, there are no space Catholics, there are no space Lutherans. It's not like History of the World Part 1 that ends with the History of the World Part 2 with Jews in space. I'm not being offensive. That's actually from a Mel Brooks movie, so lump it. There's nothing like that. It's not like The Expanse, which frankly I think had a very clever, very thoughtful, and also interestingly respectful take on Mormons.
Yeah.
Mormons in space.
Yeah, because that was like, what's his name? Main guy. The main guy's whole family were like very religious. When I was thinking, he was like, he left them and did his own thing.
So other franchises have dealt with this differently, but there's no real Earth religions except for a very fuzzy wuzzy sense of like Native American, this mishmash of Native American spirituality. And I mean, honestly, let's face it, saying Native American is like saying European.
Yeah.
Like, so do you mean the Poles or do you mean the Spaniards? Because they're both European, but there's a really, whatever.
Yeah.
They just avoid it, but they do address the idea of religion, albeit through alien cultures, which then I suppose maybe that creates padding so that they figure, well, no one's going to get chapped.
Yeah, that's what I think. If you're playing in a role-playing game, I mean, realistically, if you want to play a character who is deeply religious, it kind of like, well, you need to play Bajoran then. Well, what happens if I want to play a deeply religious human person from Earth, where we have religion?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't believe that in 300 years all of the churches fell over. I mean, most of these churches have been around for sort of between 1,000 and 500 years already. They're not falling over in the next 300 years. And most of them get fixed anyway. So again, not an issue. So what you're going to tell me all like, places like Spain and Italy, very Catholic countries, suddenly no one from those countries.
Or that like all of a sudden Islam is going to just disappear. I just don't. So yeah, really those should still, and it's nothing to do with just because there's aliens exist, then people just stop having religion. I don't buy that for a second. If anything, it might turn people
who aren't religion and more onto religion potentially.
Yeah, we've got
So
no
yeah,
idea. It's all conjecture.
exactly. But the idea that there is no religion in the future, I
No
just like
Earth religion, and there are
no Earth
plenty of
religion.
comments in Star Trek about like, and Jean-Luc Picard has a couple of monologues about how we have evolved past that. Ha ha ha! Those silly people. That take. I'm thinking of one episode in particular. I don't remember the name of it. The Picard, when they throw a spear into the Picard, and he tells these aliens about how, oh yeah, we evolved past that silly hokum. Um, like okay, so the tough thing is I think you're absolutely right in most like in Star Trek and in a lot of science fiction properties, Earth religion is just it's not even hand waved, it's just flat out ignored. It plays no role, and yet unless you look at things like Mutant Chronicles, but they weren't, those were like weird analogs, like weirdo
Yeah.
analogs for or 40K. But that's like something
Ooh.
they
Yeah,
took
let's not touch 40K.
no, but it's like it's weird. It's like they took some imagery and they took some like vague sense of the icons or ideas of,
Yeah.
and then they turned it into something completely different. So they have religion and religion matters, but it's not. It's so far away or such an alternate future that they're able to completely unplug from reality.
I mean, to actually pick another Modiphius one, then stay on the same bent. Infinity does explicitly in parts talk about religion. So one of
Does
the
it? Yeah, I
main
haven't seen.
factions, I can't remember if called, I think they just call Hack Islam, which is, I think it's essentially sort of like
Oh, you're
New
right. They do.
Islam.
But it took a different direction or
Yeah, it
something
took a
like
different
that.
route,
Yeah,
but it still
okay, I remember
works
now.
off that. And like there was a faction which was just like a pool of China and Korea and Japan,
Yeah.
and they kind of smushed it all together, and they would have had elements to it. But then the Japanese kind of faction kind of separated off its own thing. So they do have, well, I mean, in the one of the things literally have almost like warrior nuns. They have like these sort of like
Yep.
these reverends, or I can't remember what they're called, but again, that's the whole thing. So they do, but again, maybe that's because that is a game designed by Spaniards who were like, well, we think there would be religion in space because there's loads of religion here, and like, we don't see it disappearing in the future.
Yeah.
So they put religion into their games and actually try to be very respectful of different religions and what they might
Yeah.
look like in the future.
I remember actually that reading that. I mean, I haven't read that part of Infinity in a long time, but I do remember that and thinking that's really fascinating and actually, and yeah, for lack of a better word, respectful.
Yeah. I mean, particularly, so in Infinity, you essentially have that kind of transhuman idea that you can upload your brain into a cube and then, download into potentially another body. It's not quite to the extreme of sort of altered carbon or something, but, that's a part of the background. And obviously they kind of go into the religious aspect of that to some extent, and that problems that would cause, which is good because that's, you could do whole sessions about the problems involved in that.
I think the big one though, we talked to, I think dispensing with like science fiction settings. I think the big one is what we're implying by our backgrounds here is religions in fantasy games. And I think that's I mean, I don't want to I don't know what modern, I mean, but I think fantasy games is the big one.
Yes. So if we're thinking like, well, it's just, the main one, D&D, we might talk about Conan, which I think mine's from.
Sure.
I might talk about Conan later. Like that's almost coming full circle to some extent. But yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking D&D where, most we'll get to the exceptions. There are exceptions, as you pointed out the other day. But if we're thinking like Forgotten Realms, which is the bog standard D&D setting, there are a whole bunch of gods who exist in, for example, the Forgotten Realms. Now, at some point, for those who don't realize, because people will have only picked up D&D with 5th edition.
Yep.
Back in the day, there was a massive jump. I think it was between 2nd and 3rd. It was certainly during the time 2nd was out. They did a whole storyline where essentially the gods walked among. They were all kicked out of wherever they hang around the rest of the time, the various planes, and they all came to take avatars of people walking around on the planet. And I can't remember why it happened or how it finished. And at the end of it, they all ended up back where they came from, except some of the gods literally died
Yep.
and some of the other people ascended and became gods. Now, that is a example where the gods literally walked amongst people. But even the rest of the time, you have clerics and paladins who are doing stuff which we would perceive to be magic. But they make it very clear this magic is coming from my god. I can bring this person back from the dead because I am a priest of whatever.
Such and such, yeah.
I can smite these undead with my holy power because I am a paladin of whoever.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of my thing is, and this is where I can get controversial. I'm not trying to offend anyone, but okay, if I look at what we have in modern day, we have people who have, like you mentioned, faith. Okay, faith to me would be you're believing in something because there's no necessarily proof in it. So whether, I'm talking about scientific proof. Okay, so before I get something, scientific proof.
Right.
So faith becomes a matter of I believe or I do not believe,
based on some package of reasoning.
Yeah.
That may not, that others may look at and say that doesn't square with what we consider to be demonstrable science. Yeah, that works.
Whereas in D&D, so like Forgotten Realms specifically, that is not the case. There is literal proof. I mean, the exception, I go, some smart out and go, well, I don't think there's a god letting that priest heal it, but he's still healing people.
Yeah.
This isn't, it's not our, this isn't our, faith healer who says something and someone who could already walk can now suddenly walk. This isn't,
right.
Reiki healing or acupuncture. This isn't some kind of, it may be or whatever. This is genuinely someone, they've lost their arm and someone puts their hand over the arm where he goes, this is a person who is dead
and comes back
from the dead. This is like, this is magic. This is genuine. This is not like, there's a clever science thing or a cycle or anything else. This is just straight up. Tricks. Yeah, this is straight
or
up.
Like, the zombies, the undead attack you and the cleric or the paladin holds up a holy symbol and they disintegrate.
Yeah. So this is straight up like, this is magical stuff.
Yes.
And that is coming from somewhere. Now, okay, yes, we have got wizards who are doing magical stuff, but they're very, people are very clear on where their powers are coming from. If you're in this situation then where it is very, very clear that the gods do exist, whether the gods are good or bad, let's ignore that for the minute. That's a whole other thing. But the gods do exist. Surely people should act differently.
Yeah.
Because you started right at the start by making the point that some of the way people might act is based on the way they're raised and the religious, the religion they are part of, and the various, part of that religion that they live their life by, or things they do for certain reasons. And yet in a fantasy world where religion, the gods walk among us and they are literally like real, we can definitely see they're real. I'm not going to go into whether gods are real or not. That's not the point of this. In that fantasy world, 100% they are real.
Right.
Totally real. Surely that changes things then.
Yeah.
Because we can go through history of this. We know that points of history, we have had priests say, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you will go to hell, which is a large chunk in the Dark Ages of people going to doing things, and we still always had criminals because we couldn't prove it. If you are in a fantasy world and there's a god of justice and the priest of justice stands outside his church and says, if you don't do this, you will go to hell. That's not I do or don't believe. That's oh yeah, I've seen it because I saw the paladin of justice smite this dude the other day because he did something.
Or maybe it's not necessarily the response is, oh, well, you say your God is going to send me to, I'm going to be punished because I'm not living up to your teachings. Well, I've got this other God and that's going to, he, she, it, whatever, it is more powerful than, like, your God's really not a God. Your God's just like a demigod or like a, really powerful magic entity or something like that. And mine's, but you're right. There would be, I think people would behave differently. I think people would see things differently. They would react to some of those things differently. Now, going into this episode, thinking about this, I was primarily thinking about the characters, non-player and player characters, who are professed adherents of and empowered by. That's what I was thinking of. I wasn't thinking about like broader populations as a whole. Like, we have plenty of sorry examples in our in the real world of people using their, you clashes between, like, Catholics and Protestants in some parts of the world. Okay, that's one example. you know, and I think it makes perfect sense that perhaps like, you know, you have what if you have a big city, big fantasy city, and there are like two gods that are most popular, and there's a clash, but well, it could be, you know what I mean? Just don't have a soccer match.
Well, I started exactly that because you like the classic where we have in this country where we mix religion and sport is in Glasgow, where we literally have a Protestant football team and a Catholic football team. And ideally, it would either be people talking about religion sensibly or just watching a football match.
Yeah.
And it turns
And
into
then you put the
something
two together and it gets
way
ugly.
more than that.
But I mean, my thinking was more along the lines of player characters and non-player characters, and how, frankly, in my experience, and this is like the lowest hanging fruit for me, my lowest hanging gripe is your cleric, who, I mean, all the god or religion is, or domain is, if you go back to like, you know, earlier editions for that kind of stuff, all it is just an on paper structure that dictates what kinds of spells you have and what kind of powers you have. There's nothing else attached to it. Now, I recognize that in plenty of different churches, like and just using this as an example because there's a hierarchy and there's a structure. You know, the Roman Catholic Church, there are plenty of people who play different roles. You know, there are some people of the cloth in the Roman Catholic Church whose job it is to evangelize. You know, the monks, priests, the exorcists, there are different roles. So it's not like everyone is out there preaching on a corner. But I just find it, aside from the stupid hand wave of like, well, I got up and prayed, you know, and like how many GMs out there, let's be honest, how many GMs actually make that a headache? Like, well, you got to pray, or we're going to have the goblins attack at dawn while you're praying. And or if your paladin is of some order where they're like really hardcore about, no, you must pray at this time. You must pray X many times per day in this manner, and you can't not do it. Well, and that's when the goblins attack, or that's when the hobgoblins like run off with the villagers or something like that. And the paladin's like, nope. Like how many GMs actually think about that and incorporate that and ask their players to make choices based on their character's professed beliefs? No, it's just an on-paper conduit that gives you some structure for your powers. Yeah. And beyond that, it's nothing. There's no story to it.
I think particularly with clerics, you end up just having, you know, there's no special rules or restrictions. You can do whatever you want. Your power is not taken away when you don't do the right thing. You have a spell list, and your spell list is, you know, bigger because the god's given you it. But then the wizard guy has a not as big spell, and the poor warlock's got like 5 spells because, you know, he's only got his power for like a really small entity.
Yeah, but how many GMs ask the warlock character to like you know, if your patron is some creepy fae, we're like, you're going to come spend an amount of time in my Feywild with me, and you're going to be my little like leather masked biatch for a while. Like, you know, honestly, what, like, you have all these powers. What does this weird entity want in return? Maybe it wants things that come across as benign. Maybe it wants things that are horrific. Nobody ever plays that.
You'll see people play paladins like that, but that's the perception. Oh, a paladin has to be this lawful good. Well, maybe not so much now if they don't have but when you had to, you know, when you had to be a lawful good paladin.
We're talking about 5e. I mean, we're talking about just watered down like Drek, you know, everything is just like, anything. It's nothing.
The old school paladin was properly, you know, and even like, I mean, Brian played a paladin in our Strahd thing, and that was fine because we were mostly fighting undead. But yeah, a lot of time, you know, you end up playing the paladin like, well, it's a paladin, I've got to play him like an arsehole. I'm gonna be straight and narrow. Can't deviate from that. I'm going to follow all of these rules. It's my way or the highway. There's no slightly illegal stuff. I mean, he didn't play it like that because he knew that would be annoying. But that's how people were playing paladins back in the day. That's what it said in the book.
Yep.
But then why doesn't it say that for clerics?
Yeah.
Clerics should still have a similar thing. But, you know, you'd have a cleric that, I'm not allowed to use swords or axes. I've got to use blunt things. Well, but there's nothing about how you have to act. If you want to go around like backstabbing people by smacking them over the head with a, you know, mace, you were allowed to do that. There's nothing stopping you multi-classing, you know, rogue cleric and go around stealing off everyone and assassinating people, because there's just nothing like that in the rules. So then you end up with just a priest is another way of getting a spell list.
You know, I remember how Eberron, which is I think I've said this before, I'm sure, it's my favorite D&D setting by a long shot. Um, it Eberron does some interesting things, and it also does some like head scratching things when it comes to clerics and the gods. Is that first off, the gods in Eberron, if you don't know this, are more distant than in other D&D settings. They are not. They don't walk among the people. Okay, aside from the silver flame, which could be some kind of super powerful supernatural entity, nobody, like some kind of like powerful force that's not necessarily a god, but the followers of the silver flame believe that. But the sovereign host and the dark six, which are like the good gods and the bad gods, don't walk among the people. And so there is a questioning, a broad-based questioning over whether they're real or not. That I think makes sense because of how the authors, how they said, well, listen, the gods aren't walking among the people. And so there is this questioning of. Now, on the other hand, you can be a neutral evil cleric of a good god, which to me is like that like what unless there's story commentary that digs into like, well, maybe the gods, maybe they're really not good. This god really isn't good. It's something else. Like it's good-ish. You think it's good, but it's just a source of power. But it's still, that never gets answered, one. And the other thing is, it still goes back to the question of, well, what does the thing want in return for granting you these powers? I guess that's where I'm coming from too, is like, are all gods just, do they just ignore a sense of quid pro quo? Like they grant these humans, or these human, whatever, they grant these characters these powers, and they grant them more and more and bigger and more powerful over time, and yet they ask nothing in return.
Well, the assumption would be, they're spreading the God's word, but
nobody does
how
that.
many clerics? Yeah, no, exactly. People aren't going in the name. I mean, people who are playing the characters well maybe are, but are they meant to be doing that over the top? And then surely they should have a list of stuff. I mean, that then really falls into a GM side of things. Right?
Yeah.
If you're working this guy, I mean, like certainly for alignment, I would usually make sure that a player matches there, because it used to be we didn't have that, but nowadays your gods would have alignment. I would say you should match the alignment to the god. But actually, that's a bit simplified, because again, if we come back to the real world, I'm going to pick a bad guy from Cardinal Richelieu. He's a bad guy. He's a bad guy in the Musketeers. So if we nominally say that the Catholic faith should be lawful good, there's no way he's lawful good. He's probably like neutral evil or something.
Right.
But he was high up in the church because he's worked his way up, because you can do that in an organization. So, but I guess he's not a PC, was a bad example. But that would still be the same thing, that, like you said, you should then be able to not have your alignment match the god.
Would he?
It's just falling apart.
Like Richelieu, actually, that's a really interesting example, because if you were to play this like D&D of old, he would have lost his powers, right? Now, on the other hand, though, could he actually have then turned into a cleric of like an evil god? Or maybe he's not a cleric at all. Maybe he's a wizard or a magic user, if you really want to go back in time. Maybe he's that, but like on a worldly side, he's wearing the cloth. He has the power, the political and the social authority. But on like the magical side, it's not. It's something completely different. So I think that frankly, that makes a lot more sense than like a good god being like, well, this really terrible person's doing really terrible things that are against everything I stand for, but I still give him powers.
I mean, you'd like to think most clerics will play, a good role player should play his cleric in the way that is doing something more. Should. But should. How many do or don't? Right. So that's from the character point. So let's. What about the idea of literally society and NPCs? Because I would maintain that if the gods are walking among us, people should not act like, like they did back in, people go back to ancient times, like, oh, well, we'll go back and look at how things were in like Greece or Egypt and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, again, there was powerful people then. Maybe more people believe the gods were real. But even in Greece, loads of people would like pay lip service to it, because they were, this like kind of higher thought. Then you probably a load of people who would say they believe in the gods because they're worried about getting done over their head if they say they don't, but probably didn't. But again, this isn't a thing where people do believe. I mean, actually, like your Protestant Catholics in the good thing. How many times would you straight up just in a city have wars between? I mean, if they want a better word, rival fans, because this is the point before we did this episode, I've kind of said this, like, if you live in a town where there's 20 different gods, do you worship all of them, or do you pick one? And if you pick one, how do you decide which one? Is it the one your parents had? can now it start sounding like a sport? Oh, well, my parents supported
Yeah.
Zeus, so I'm going to support Zeus as well. I don't like Odin because he's the rival god to Zeus in a whole different pantheon thing.
But
So
it's a different matter. Like so you've got all that. And that I think is analogous to the way people lend their support to things in the real world. Like, why do people end up supporting the political party that they do? It's oftentimes because of what they're taught by their surroundings, and they become convinced that that's right, and it's actually less a rational than a received decision. Okay,
yeah,
you can make sense of, well, I support Zeus, not Odin, for that reason. But what happens when Zeus shows up and stomps the temple of Odin into nothing, and you watch it happen? And you were the Odin worshiper. Are you just really pissed off? Are you crestfallen? Are you like, I support Kanye's gods? You know what I mean? Like what happens then? I think, yeah, there's that question of when the gods make themselves known in undeniable ways, not ways, I attributed that storm that, like, our cleric to whatever, prayed to the Red Knight and we had success in battle. So you attribute it to, it's like, no, the Red Knight showed up and hacked killed the enemy army. Like, there's a difference.
Yeah.
How does that affect how people act, how characters, and like you just said it, the masses?
Yeah.
How does that affect it? And I just don't, it's unfortunate. I think that's a dimension of like the persons and the people that are part of stories in these games that just by and large is overlooked. It's definitely overlooked by the vast majority of publishers. It's like they just stay away from it.
I think they just gloss over. I mean, you'll see these books of, like, gods and stuff, and it will explain what the gods are like, and it might explain what their church is like, and it will explain what they were. But there's never a thing that kind of, okay, well, how is this affecting day-to-day society? Because you have got all these. I mean, is someone like, oh, I'm going to hedge all my bets and I'm going to go to every single church every single week to make sure I'm hitting the one that's going to be winning this week, or do you have a thing, like, is there a standing in which god has got more worshippers in there, therefore they're more powerful, or is it based on pantheons as opposed to there's so many different ways you can look at it, but
now
it just gloss over it. You just ignore it. There are gods and they give
I have
power.
seen one game that, and this is very recent with my Castles and Crusades infatuation, but they have a book called, what is it called? The hell is it called? It sits right over here on my shelf.
Falls off his chair.
What am I, blind?
Well, you haven't got your glasses on.
Gods and Legends. It's called Gods and Legends, and it has all the gods of their stock world, Erida or Erd or whatever, however it's pronounced, and then it has a whole bunch of your stock, gods from human history, and all the ones, I haven't read the book completely, but all the ones for their world, they have rituals or practices or observances tied to each of them, that if worshipers do those things, they get certain things or certain things happen. And the neat thing about it is they're not all the same. It's not like, well, if you do this thing once a month, you get this +2 bonus. Like that would be what 5e would do. Like it would be completely the same under the hood. Everything would be a 4-cylinder engine, no matter what the car looked like. These are actually different. Like if you do these things for this god, you experience this kind of bonus for this period of time, or you get to do this thing once or twice. So they have built into the story, tied to their proprietary deities, observances, practices, rituals, blah, 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 that can be done by followers that have real world effects. And that's the only time I've seen something like that. If you're listening to this or watching us and you have another game that provides something like this, where there's this varied selection of, this is what happens when you are the real deal as a follower, let us know, because I'm not aware of it. But I think, yeah, Gods and Legends has that. And I was like, whoa, that's really interesting. In fact, in the Kingmaker, the campaign we're going to start running next month, I think what I'm going to do, because just for the sake of ease, I think we're going to stick with the Pathfinder gods' names, but I might go ahead and pin each of these Castles and Crusades gods to each of those, so that because we have a cleric, or probably a cleric in the party, if the cleric wants to do those kinds of things, well, they have that option.
Cool.
And I think that would be I think that'd be cool, but you just don't see that. And that could be something that the characters do. That could be something that major NPCs do, or something that you just say happens in the background. Like you're in the city and they're having this, here's this quarterly or it's with the I don't know, whatever, some time of the year or something like that. And this thing happens because of this ceremony or attendant to this ceremony. Like that would be kind of cool, but like I said, you just don't see that. It doesn't seem like it, at least.
I wonder if the opposite reaction could be true, that because there's so many gods and so much magic, like if you're in a magic heavy setting, that maybe people just get so blasé about it, they just switch off and they're not bothered. But again, I don't think that's how people are playing it. People are they just treat gods like it's a thing on a sheet. It's like I have what race I am, and I'm going to just play my character just the same, regardless of my race. And
right. I'm just using these bonuses because I like them.
Yeah, I like the bonuses. I like the idea of being a dwarf, and I want to do a fake Scottish accent, but I'm just going to play it the same. And I have an alignment which I'm going to pay lip service to if you have an alignment system. And then there's a slot for God. So I've written a God that I like the sound of because I want to occasionally say, in Zeus's name, whatever. And none of it means anything because it's just some stuff that's in the background and doesn't care from the day to day. And like I said, the thing that made me think about this was because the current Critical Role arc is that literally the characters are having to essentially do something to stop some bad guys that are trying to release a monster which will destroy all the gods potentially. So their conversation, again, they are having to have these conversations. They do have a cleric, and cleric much like, well, come on, the rest of you must believe in the gods. And they're like, well, we believe because it's not a matter of belief. We know the gods are real.
Yeah.
We just don't care. And then it's a case of, well, should we save the gods or not? And they're like, yeah, you got like half of them are like, yeah, I guess we should save the god. Some of them are like, actually, I don't give a monkeys about the gods. I'd be quite happy if the gods all died. But the guys we fight, and we know they are assholes. So on that basis, we should stop them because whatever they're trying to do is probably bad. But actually, I'm not bothered about the gods one way or the other. And you think, that seems like a funny attitude. Well, the gods don't bother me, so I don't bother. And you think, okay, I can see maybe people would have that. That I can see that as an attitude. But again, that's a thought. That's still a thought process that a player has gone through to go, that's going to be my opinion. And I think, despite the fact we play in these fantasy worlds where these gods are a thing, most people just like, unless you're a cleric or a paladin, most people just go, oh, I'm not going to think about that. It doesn't apply to me. Well, it should apply to you.
It just, what it seems like? It seems like there's so much plot, story, and character potential that's just left on the table. And it's actually not even it's left on the table and covered up with the tablecloth. It's like people don't even recognize that there are these, as a GM, there are ways to challenge and inspire, I think, like motivate, that is, your players to have to work through things or have to make tough choices or experience something cool that I just think they're being ignored. Like I personally am not satisfied when every session is a walkover for the players when I'm running the game. That's not satisfying. Like when it's like, you get a this and you get it, everyone wins. It's like, as I call it, California Little League. You get a freaking trophy for having a pulse. And you can con your way out of that, even if you don't. You just show up, and you don't even have to show up. You just ask. They just send you the damn trophy and tell you that you're great. That is so tiring. It's so tiring to me. And so you have to challenge the players sometimes. Things matter when there's something to be lost, and if there's something that must be gained, and there's something that must be traded away for it, like that leaves a mark. And it's emotionally, I think that makes for great satisfying. It makes for great satisfying stories. It makes for great satisfying games. And so, if you have a cleric or paladin who really means what they mean, or better yet, maybe even a character that isn't powered up by a god, but says, I believe this, and is willing to sacrifice something for it because there's something good, right, whatever, to be gained from it. It's just left unexplored. And it's unfortunate because, again, if people really believe, their motivations and their values are going to be, and their actions are going to be shaped by those beliefs. Well, we just don't explore those things at the table. And I think, unfortunately, it leaves a very thin broth.
Yeah.
it's just missed opportunity.
It is, because it's potential conflict between characters. If you might have people, oh, the elf and the dwarf don't like each other because of history. What about if it's just the characters have a different religion? Like people in this world do occasionally argue with each other because of different religions. So surely the same would be in a thing. You worship two rival gods, well, you're going to be falling out with each other all the time and having discussions about it. But again, it's the thing, do you only follow? How do you only follow one god when you know multiple gods are real?
Well, and you know what?
I mean, that's why we said last time that the following the sports team thing is the thing that makes more sense to me, because like in this, in this day and age, because I'm not talking about religion, most people follow a team. Most people will have, that's my team, and then maybe I have a second team, and this other country I've got a different team, that kind of thing, or this different sport. That I could see that being the thing. Well, my dad supported Zeus, so I support Zeus. But my wife, unfortunately, she supports whatever.
It's all about Hermes.
Yeah, and so, but I just have to put up with that. But and then it's like supporting a sports team. I'm not going to, maybe
at the end of the day, it's benign.
Yeah.
Well, something else too is that you talked about conflict between characters, and it could create conflict between characters, player characters, non-player characters, or combinations thereof. It could also be more benign friction, where one is like, hey, listen, the paladin, for example, I my god that I completely follow, I have to stop and pray for 30 minutes 3 times a day, or once a month on the new moon I have to do this. And he's like, it's not like that big of a deal until maybe it becomes a big deal. But the character's like, no, I have to do that. Or like, no, I can't stay in that kind of an inn because of blase or whatever. It just adds ripples to the story that make the characters more interesting and plausible, instead of just all the character is a bunch of abilities written on paper and the urge to win. That's all the character is.
I think there are interesting stories that you can tell them, but people, nowadays, particularly, people don't want to offend anyone, so we'll just avoid it altogether. Like kind of like the stuff that still drives me. I mean, it's not really the same thing, but when they basically put in D&D that racial bonuses, well, you could ignore and have any racial bonus you wanted that matched the racial bonuses you wanted. Well, but that doesn't make any.
To quote when you Syndrome, say that when everyone's super, nobody is.
When you say that a halfling can have a strength bonus because you don't want to upset halfling players that want to be strong, you go, but a halfling's child. Are you telling me a child?
You know what, Chris? I can do you one better.
Someone who's 7 foot tall.
Halflings aren't real.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter when we have these made up fantasy races with different racial bonus. That isn't like racial profiling, because it's nothing to do with the real world. It's a fictional fantasy thing. Then you've got people, but I want to play, I don't want to play an elf that's dexterous and intelligent. Right, all the rules are saying is that elves are naturally more dexterous and intelligent. That's the point. They are physically different.
Right.
It's not a real world parallel.
Like, well,
so it doesn't matter.
One of the things that Star Trek, every Star Trek series has had the alien who serves as a counterpoint to certain aspects of humanity. Like Mr. Spock was that in the original series. Worf and Data were that in Next Generation. Like we do that. We take some human traits and we concentrate them in certain characters in order to serve as examples, as counterpoints against the norm. And when you make everyone, anyway, never mind.
Grumble, I think that's the same thing that happens. The religious thing, is it? People are worried about offending anyone with a real world look at a religion. So we won't look at it at all.
I think that's it.
Then you're missing potential stories and conflict and interesting things, because it might get uncomfortable for people. I mean, it's different when you come closer to the real world. When you come you look at, what is it, Deadlands, and they're like, oh, well, we're not sure what we want to do with slavery. Well, here's what you should do. It did happen. So it should be a thing that has happened, and it's still an issue, because
if you're going to fictionalize a real era of history, I think you do well to take into account all the major issues, trends, and things of the real history that you're playing with. Like, it would be absurd, and I know that obviously they didn't do this. It would be absolutely absurd if Modifius was like, hey, let's make a World War II occult game, but let's leave out Nazis because we don't want to offend Germans. Like, that's silly. You have to take it for what it is. You fictionalize the piece of it that you want to, and then you run with it, and you hope that people go, yeah, this isn't real. I'm with you completely. I think that, and here's my charge to people listening, is that there's a lot of story, a lot of character interaction, and a lot of internal character development that you leave on the table unless you consider, in a fantasy world, the gods are real, the gods walk among us, and the gods do things that people can point at and say, yeah, or at least some people could point at and say, yeah, that's real. How would that affect people's behavior? How would that affect your characters? That is apostrophe S and a S apostrophe behavior. And I think if you ignore that, you leave stuff on the table.
Yeah, I think the other option is that if you're doing a fantasy world, to go, actually, well, I don't acknowledge the presence of gods. It's all too happen. And we're just not going to have gods. Right, well, then you don't have gods, in which case you have to seriously consider what you are doing with those classes that rely on them. So, for example, Dark Sun famously has no gods. They still had clerics, but their clerics were basically clerics of like the elements.
Yeah.
So they were essentially druids. Or, they got their power from the sun or something. So you have to completely swerve it. And again, I can't remember if paladins existed or not. I'm still convinced that like the dragons, which were like the main things in Dark Sun, like gave powers to people. But I've been looking it up, but I can't find it anymore.
But still, I mean, if that's I don't know, because I'm like so not familiar with Dark Sun. Yeah. But I mean, if that's the case, if there's this idea, if there is a source of power, and either those sources of powers they're sentient and they're giving power to mortals to do things for whatever reason, or if there's some way that mortals can like reflect or drain off some of that power, what does that take from them? Again, if you don't look into this, I think you're leaving stuff on the table. You're leaving story on the table.
Yeah, I think there's a good girl. Someone put on Reddit that actually said, right, if they were doing like a 5e Dark Sun campaign, basically said paladins and warlocks will be exclusive to Templars, who are like the warriors of the dragon kings, princes, whatever they were called. Yeah. So they will only be NPCs. You will not be allowed to play those as a player, because those are straight up the bad guys. So you can't play one and end up. So no way. But at least that's a choice. That's a really good. They've gone right. Yeah. Well, there are no gods, and because there are no gods, these classes don't exist. Yeah. If you have those kind of classes and players playing them, then they should be acting different, and they should be interacting with people who are. I mean, if you're a cleric that walks into a town, and you're like spouting off the name of cleric, everyone and their son should be coming after you for some healing, because maybe they don't have a town cleric, or they can't afford.
You show up brandishing the holy symbol of Splapdor, and that town, it happens to be majority like Flingelblap. The Flingelblap people, are they going to like throw tomatoes at you? Are they going to make fun of you? Or you show up in a town where Splapdor has a pretty big following, and all of a sudden people are like buying you drinks, or there's a structure of treatment and courtesies that the character should play out. Again, it's just, I think if you're going to have clerics or paladins, I think you just need to ask the question of, okay, like where their power source, like what comes attendant to that? Like what responsibilities or demands or requirements are come with that? I think that's pretty simple.
Yeah. So there's our view of religion in games, which is games be getting it wrong.
Thank you so much for listening. You can visit our show's homepage at anchor.fm/fluffncrunch. That's FLUFFNCRUNCH. We would really appreciate feedback and reviews on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to this on. Thanks so much.